Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. All right, welcome. This is the Veritas podcast. He's Rob. I'm Robert. We apologize for the brief hiatus. Life goes on, though. We've come back, so we appreciate everybody's patience. In the previous episode of Libertas, we discussed the proper way to return to God. And this is in the middle of a discussion of religious liberty. We talked about how the idea that we need supernatural life in our soul to return to God. The only way to do this is to have the proper religion. After this, we moved on and discussed the idea of virtue. Pope Leo pronounces that virtue is found in true religion. The true religion, Catholicism, leads man to the true end for which he was made. False religions cannot do this. And they cannot lead men to the true end because they offer false worship, have false knowledge of God, and they permit improper behavior. They lead people away from God. Pope Leo talks about that. So now, in this episode, we continue Leo's admonition about religious liberty. We've gone over this so much before, so we won't spend as much time on it in this paragraph as we have in the past. In paragraph 21 is where we pick up. The Supreme Pontiff writes that religious liberty means that no one of a religion is to be preferred over another. That's the idea of religious liberty. This leads to the idea that the state has no duties to religion. Leo labels these assertions as false. Leo then directs civil society, quote, to acknowledge God as founder and parent and must obey and reverence his power and authority. End of quote. Everybody just kind of think about that and listen to this and how antithetical it is to the modern age. He continues, quote, justice, therefore, forbids, and reason itself forbids, the state to be godless or to adopt a line of action which would end in godlessness, namely, to treat the various religions, as they call them, alike and to bestow upon them promiscuously equal rights and privileges. Since then, the profession of one religion is necessary in the state. That religion must be professed which alone is true and which can be recognized without difficulty. End of quote.
Yeah, this is the consistent teaching of the Church, that the state has a duty to profess the true religion and should at most tolerate false religions. Ideally, as we mentioned a few episodes ago, only the true religion would be permitted in the state. But if there's a large population of non-Catholics, it may be more prudent to tolerate false religions in order to preserve the stability in the country. If you try to forbid, say, the Muslim religion when there's 40% Muslims, it would probably cause an uprising, and you don't want that. So prudence would dictate that you would tolerate the false religion until hopefully the false religion would fade away or deteriorate to the point where you could then forbid that religion and only have the true religion in the state. But the state, even if it does tolerate false religions for prudence sake, it should never, a Catholic state should never put false religions on the same level as the true religion. It should always be clear there's one true religion. We're tolerating this false religion. It's interesting, the Council of Vienne, was in the 1200s or 1300s. The Pope at the time, I forget his name, but he actually did forbid, using the authority of the Council, he forbade the Muslim religion in Catholic land. It was permitted at that point, but he had had enough, and he said these Muslims were offending the Catholics with their false worship by publicly proclaiming Allah in a public square, and so he forbade that, and he commanded the Christian soldiers to put an end to it. So you can see how the Church does tolerate sometimes false religions when you have a Catholic state, but sometimes it stops tolerating them when prudence dictates that they should be no longer tolerated.
Rob, I think that Pope was Pope Clement V.
Yep, it was Pope Clement V, and I've got the quote right here. This is from the Council of Vienne. Quote, "It is an insult to the holy name and a disgrace to the Christian faith that in certain parts of the world subject to Christian princes where Saracens live, sometimes apart, sometimes intermingled with Christians, the Saracen priests, commonly called Zabazala, in their temples or mosques, in which the Saracens meet to adore the infidel, Muhammad, loudly invoke and extol his name each day at certain hours from a high place, in the hearing of both Christians and Saracens, and there make public declarations in his honor. Skipping a few sentences, quote, "This brings disrepute on our faith and gives great scandal to the faithful. These practices cannot be tolerated any further without displeasing the divine majesty. We therefore, with the sacred council's approval, strictly forbid such practices henceforth in Christian lands. We enjoin on Catholic princes, one and all, who hold sovereignty over the said Saracens and in whose territory these practices occur, and we lay on them a pressing obligation under the divine judgment that, as true Catholics and zealous for the Christian faith, they give consideration to the disgrace heaped on both them and other Christians. They are to remove this offense altogether from their territories and take care that their subjects remove it, so that they may thereby attain the reward of eternal happiness. They are to forbid expressly the public invocation of the sacrilegious name of Muhammad. They shall also forbid anyone in their dominions to attempt in the future the said pilgrimage or in any way give countenance to it. Those who presume to act otherwise are to be so chastised by the prince for their irreverence that others may be deterred from such boldness," unquote. That comes from a general council of the church ratified by the Pope.
And it's really kind of irrefutable. And that kind of brings up our next point. We're going to skip paragraph 22, where Leo talks about how religion is good for the state, and get right to paragraph 23 because of what Rob is writing about. If the listeners can remember, a couple episodes ago, Rob, we talked about, and I gave that quote from Cardinal Dolan to refresh your memory. He says, quote, "In religious freedom reinforces other freedoms of conscience, of the press, and of assembly, to name just a few," end quote. Cardinal Dolan was arguing in favor of religious liberty when he wrote that. Religious liberty, according to Dolan, is good because it leads to these other freedoms. You just heard an older pope condemning this idea. Let's hear what Leo says. Pope Leo writes that, quote, "Our freedom of speech," end quote, "must be used in moderation." Leo explains what a right is in the quote we have just used previously in this series. It's important to repeat, though. Everybody listen, quote, "For right is a moral power which, as we have before said and must again and again repeat, it is absurd to suppose that nature has accorded indifferently to truth and falsehood, to justice and injustice." End of quote. Pope Leo is saying that truth and lies are not equal when he refers to nature, and therefore are not accorded the same due attention. Pope Leo is saying that we do have a right to speak the truth, but not a right to speak lies. So Rob, can you explain to us why that is?
Yep. Well, if you think about it, we don't have a right to lie because where do our rights come from? Our rights come from God, and what does the Eighth Commandment forbid? The Eighth Commandment forbids lying. So obviously if our rights come from God, and God forbids that we lie, obviously we don't have a right to lie. Now, a lie, a subjective lie, when you speak of someone lying, it means that they're saying something other than what they believe. So if I get pulled over by the police and the police comes up and I told them, "Oh, I have my seatbelt on, but I just took it off to get my wallet out," and I was not telling the truth, that would be a lie, a subjective lie. But what's being forbidden here is not only a subjective lie, it's an objective falsehood, something that's objectively false regardless of what the individual speaker thinks. So the speaker might think something is true, but it's false. So a Muslim, for example, he may not believe in the Trinity. or he may not believe that Jesus is God. He's not allowed to publicly spread those errors because those errors are objectively false, and errors corrupt the intellect. Also, no one is morally allowed to spread immoral literature around because immoral literature leads to the immoral behavior. So errors corrupt the intellect, and then immoral literature or propagating homosexuality or any of this stuff that we see today, that should also be forbidden because that will corrupt the heart and lead to an immoral society. Think about it. If somebody witnessed a person vandalizing a church building, okay, they would no doubt do all they could to stop it or call the police. They wouldn't just allow someone to vandalize a church building, especially not if they were a Catholic and it was a Catholic church building because they love the church building and they don't want someone to attack it. Well, the same should be, and there also would be laws in the state. You are not allowed to vandalize church buildings or someone's house. Well, the same should be true when you're speaking about someone attacking the truths revealed by God, because the truths revealed by God are of much greater value than just a church building or someone's house. So just as it's correct and everyone can understand that it should be forbidden to allow someone to vandalize a building or to go into an art museum and destroy a great piece of art, for the same reason, and even more so, it should be forbidden for people to spread errors that corrupt the truth, that are contrary to the truths revealed by God. And that's why spreading heresy was always forbidden during Christendom, because in Christendom, people knew the truth. Today, people don't know the truth. In Christendom, they knew the truth, and they forbade people from spreading heresy because heresy corrupts the truth. And then immoral teachings, like we said. Immoral teachings, they corrupt the heart and produce sin. And these lead to a general corruption in society. So immoral teachings, even really bad language or foulness, that should also ideally be forbidden in the state by the authorities. And in the very next sentence of Libertas, after the one that you read, he said this, quote, "Men have a right freely and prudently to propagate throughout the state what things soever are true and honorable, so that as many as possible may possess them." Keep continuing on. "But lying opinions, than which no mental plague is greater, and vices which corrupt the heart and moral life should be diligently suppressed by public authority, lest they insidiously work to the ruin of the state," unquote. So you see here, error should be expressed is what he's saying, or error should be prevented, suppressed by the public authority, and immorality should also be prohibited by the public authorities.
It's really important to know, and I think you're driving this point home. We're going back to our previous episodes, one of the first couple ones, talking about this idea of natural liberty, freedom of speech is not necessarily what we think it might be. But our government itself kind of recognizes there has to be some limits to this. So I can say what I want to as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. I can't talk about wanting to assassinate the president and talk about my plan. That's against the freedom of speech. And so the government kind of sees that to a certain extent. And your analogy is great, too. Vandalizing the actual structure of a particular church is bad. But what's even worse is vandalizing the spiritual family, in a sense, of the church by spreading heresy. So, Rob, if you're an idiot and if you believe in heretical things, that's one thing, that's your own soul. But if you're the editor of a newspaper, it's quite different, right?
Right. Now, think about it. When you talk about freedom of speech, people will always say, well, freedom of speech doesn't mean you have the right to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Why not? Because that's going to be, it's going to be an inconvenience. People are going to flee the movie theater, maybe get a little bit hurt. But what is worse? Some inconvenience in a movie theater or attacking the truths revealed by God, which are necessary for salvation. See, these are integral truths that are necessary for the salvation of souls. These are of a much higher level than just the offense of yelling fire in a movie theater. So if yelling fire in a movie theater is forbidden, how much more should it be forbidden to speak or teach what's contrary to the truths revealed by God, and thereby to corrupt the intellect.
Leo begins to talk about the dangers of free speech from dangerous individuals. So we're still in paragraph 23. He writes, quote, "The excesses of an unbridled intellect, which unfailingly end in the oppression of the untutored multitude, are no less rightly controlled by the authority of the law than are the injuries inflicted by violence upon the weak. And this all the more surely, because by far the greater part of the community is either absolutely unable or able only with great difficulty to escape from illusions and deceitful subtleties, especially such as flatter the passions. If unbridled license of speech and of writing be granted to all, nothing will remain sacred and inviolate. Even the highest and truest mandates of natures, justly held to be the common and noblest heritage of the human race, will not be spared." End of quote. That's one of my favorite lines in the entire encyclical. The Pope is conceding that the majority of the average layman will not understand to the proper extent to decipher the writings of some individuals. We see this so many times when a book is written that appears on the surface to be good. The masses like the sound of it and then suddenly fall prey to it. One such book would be called The Shack. This was published a few years back. Has many, many, many pagan and occultic issues to it. But a lot of people liked it. It was really popular. In fact, one of my former colleagues and coworkers of mine knew my Catholicism and my religiosity. He gave me this book as a gift, Rob, and he thought that because it talked about God and doing the right thing, that he was doing me a favor. This thing was a bestseller. People loved it and loved it and loved it. It speaks about love and doing good, and so many people fall for it. But like I said before, there's a lot of dangers to it.
Absolutely. There can be one of the tactics the devil uses all the time is deceiving under the appearance of good. So something will appear to be good. Maybe it'll talk about God or something else, but there's hidden errors that people aren't going to pick up on. So there can be blatant errors like heresies that deny basic truths of Revelation, the Trinity or Incarnation. There can also be subtle errors like the ones you mentioned in the book. And that's why the church used to have the index of forbidden books. The index protected the people from being led astray by bad books and by deceptive books. St. Alphonsus of Gori, he said that one bad book could destroy an entire monastery. That's how much danger there is in a bad book. And today, bad books are everywhere. And we see the results. The population is completely confused intellectually and in a state of basically moral depravity.
Paragraph 23 continues, "Thus, truth being gradually obscured by darkness, pernicious and manifold error, as too often happens, will easily prevail. Thus, too, license will gain what liberty loses. For liberty will ever be more free and secure in proportion as license is kept in fuller restraint." End of quote. Rob, can you speak a little bit about this idea of untutored multitude that Leo spoke of earlier, who fall to the illusions and deceit of unbridled intellects?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a lot easier to confuse someone that doesn't know the truth and who hasn't been taught how to think than it is to deceive one who's firmly grounded in the truth. And today, the average person has not been taught the truth and doesn't know how to think, so they're easy prey for the lies that are being fed to them everywhere, especially from the media. Think about how many people today don't see a problem with contraception or divorce. Only, 1930, less than 100 years ago, virtually everyone knew that contraception was evil. It wasn't until the Lambeth Council in 1930 that the Anglican Church permitted contraception under very rare circumstances. That's the crack. That's how it opened up right there. And ever since then, it's just expanded. Today, basically, if you're against contraception, people look at you like there's something wrong with you. And there was even a law in the U.S., I think it was from late 1800s, 1876, I believe, called the Comstock Law, that forbade the distribution of literature that dealt with contraception. It also forbade distribution of literature in favor of abortion. But again, today, if you tell someone you're against contraception or tell them it's evil, they'll probably think you're joking. And the use of it's gone so far now that the use of contraception is considered an act of responsibility. It's gone.
Right when and before you go on to more, this untutored multitude, like you say, you see this all the time, but not only with the laity, but also with religious and priests. And I find this more and more, too, where one tries to be respectful towards priests who are themselves, to a certain extent, untutored, because we have seminaries who produce priests, and these priests might be good intentioned, but they don't really know a lot about, well, what you and I are talking about. It's about the idea of modernism, that kind of thing. And so they then go on and teach their parishes even more incomplete truths, if you will. And so there's so much of it, the masses, the multitude, that's just kind of an understatement.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with a priest like that, it's real difficult because they're the priest, they're in a higher position of authority, and when they're mistaken on a point, it's not real comfortable trying to correct them. I don't like doing it. I try to avoid it whenever possible, but sometimes you have to. So it's like we were saying a few episodes ago where you ask, what do you do when the hierarchy are spreading these errors? And you've got to
right.
you got to stand up and speak the truth, but it's upside down. They're the ones that are supposed to be teaching us, but when they're in error, it's going to be a bad situation. That's what we have today. Now,
and Rob, you know all too well also what kind of names you'll be called and what everybody says about those who kind of stand up to error. You're called incompassionate and uncompassionate and unmerciful and a know-it-all and more Catholic than the Pope, that kind of stuff, just because you speak. In fact, Rob, you and I could quote, well, in fact, we've done this before. We quote Leo and we get flack from it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, what happens is interesting. You'll quote these, and then they will say, well, he didn't mean what you said he meant, even though you don't give your interpretation. You just quote it, and you'll be accused of, misquoting something when you don't even give the interpretation. You'll be accused of misinterpreting it when you don't give the interpretation.
Right. Now, what about half of this equation is untutored multitude. The other half is this unbridled intellect?
Yeah, well, when people are allowed to openly spread errors, what's the result going to be when you have an untutored multitude, people who weren't taught the truth and who can't think, and now they're bombarded with errors on all sides? What's the result going to be? It's going to be confusion, confusion of the general population, which is exactly what we have today. We've talked about it before. Some of these people, if you claim to have the truth, they're offended. You have the truth. They ask that accusingly, as if it's strange that someone would have the truth. So it's gone so far. In the past, people did have the truth. Then it got confusing, and now if you do have the truth, you're accused of being the odd man out. It's strange. But there's even a bigger problem. The bigger problem today is that the so-called educated are themselves in error. And in the next few paragraphs of Libertas, the Pope speaks about the necessity of teachers only teaching what is true. He condemns what he called the liberty of teaching. That means teaching things that aren't true.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty sad times. How long, oh Lord? How long? Rob, I appreciate the discussion as always.
Okay.
Take care.